Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Why Journalism. Again, my name is Hannah Lavelle, and this podcast is part of my master's professional project through Kent State University. And in this episode, I am kind of bouncing off of what we talked about in episode 2. So if you've not listened to episode 2, I highly recommend listening to that. Episode 2 was a little bit more about journalism curriculum and what the journalism classroom looks in both college and high school. We kind of touch on both in that one, but more specifically in university and college. And we touch on like the inconsistencies in the journalism classroom. We touch a little bit about trauma education and kind of what focuses in the journalism classroom are and things like that. It wasn't super big part of it, but definitely were pieces of that podcast, which is going to be kind of continued today in my conversation. And I'll talk about my guest in just a few minutes. But we kind of talk about preparation for young journalists. And I, as I've stated, am not a journalist. I talk about that a bunch. I am a teacher. But I find that they're like I feel like a lot of careers or majors that you go into that have a specific career in mind. So in college, so things like teaching or journalism, or if you go to, to be a doctor, go to med school. You can learn a lot of great things in class, a lot of strategies, a lot of information that's going to be important, the writing style, for example, in journalism. But I think a lot of the best learning comes from actually being out in the field. So in teaching, I probably learned more in my semester of student teaching than I learned in my other 3 years. And that's not a dig at my professors who I had. I had a lot of really amazing professors who I loved, but it's just kind of seeing the structure of the job and what it's actually like is definitely very eye-opening in teaching. And I think journalism is very similar in that it's not till you actually have that adult job that you fully understand exactly what you've gotten into. Um, there's a lot of articles that kind of talk about these inconsistencies and talk about journalism ed and the preparation and trauma-informed instruction. So, for example, the article, I would definitely appreciate a little more validation by Arian Reynolds, explores student journalists at different universities, and talks about the lack of ethics and trauma studies and how these students are already kind of on this like student newspaper experiencing trauma like they will as career journalists, but have no ethics or trauma education in their program and are feeling really invalidated and are struggling to cope with it already. So they have no background with these coping strategies that they really need. Gretchen Hoke, who I've talked about in other podcasts, she also touched on this topic in Are We Teaching Trauma? And she surveyed 100 credited universities and found very few trauma-based classes in those universities. So that kind of goes back to that. And that kind of shows us that a lot of universities, I think a lot of universities at this point, especially think it's important or realize it's important, especially with professors coming in who were journalists and, have experienced these things. But I don't know if it's a lack of like fully knowing how to integrate it in, or if it's just not seeing it as still the priority and seeing, those like lectures and writing classes is more of the priority. I think it varies, but that's a big piece of it. Hill, Luther, and Slocum's 2020 article, Preparing Future Journalists for Trauma on the Job, discusses these issues as well. And they kind of state in the article that they believe that schools need these trauma courses and they need to have students learning these things. And they kind of discuss why. They also talk about just what exactly trauma looks like and how it manifests, down the line, not just today, but in coming years. How does trauma kind of affect people, and how does it like shape them, and what does it look like? And they also give their own suggestions of how to change things. So small steps like professors just kind of giving their experiences and being fully honest and transparent with kids, to offering full courses that talk about these issues and talk about coping mechanisms and these kind of little things. So it's clearly something a lot of people see a need for, and there are ideas out there and solutions out there, but it's just the actual implementation seems to to be pretty slow going, which is a little bit surprising at this point with um, the nature of the world and it feeling like there's a natural disaster or a mass shooting every day. For myself, I wonder kind of what's taking us so long or what's taking these universities so long to implement these things. Um, and Natalie Seeley's Fostering Trauma Literacy also discusses trauma integration in the classroom and its benefits. And it shows how positive it can be, not only for the journalists themselves to be able to see and understand trauma and these coping mechanisms, but also when journalists approach people who are experiencing trauma. And that's something, again, I've touched on in other episodes, especially episode 1, where journalists are constantly dealing with victims of trauma. I mean, that's their entire career, essentially, right? So if they aren't able to do that in the best way, if they're not kind of taught how to approach that, it's not good. They maybe can just not build these relationships with people that they really need to build relationships with, and it's just not the positive thing it needs to be. So there's clearly a lot of data and information on this. There's a lot of great articles out there on this topic. It's um, a lot more broad than I anticipated initially. I found a lot more sources than I thought I would, which was exciting, I think, ultimately to know that other people are concerned about this and are wondering the same things that I am and feel pretty similarly to how I do and how other people do. So, in this episode, my guest is Audra Gamble, who's a journalist in Michigan, and we had a really great chat. She was one of my first guests I talked to, and just had such a great chat about very anecdotal and very thorough, and we talked a lot about just her experiences and what her university experience looked like, as well as her first couple years as a journalist, talking about how to deal with these tragic events at 21 and 22 years old, fresh out of college, and what exactly was expected of her in that newsroom. We touched a little bit about newsroom culture and how that kind of can affect someone and, again, affect young journalists. So this episode's really for those young journalists and what exactly they need and how newsrooms and universities and the public can support them and give them the love they need. So yeah, I hope you enjoy.
Cool.
But I guess to start, can you just kind of introduce yourself, talk a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Audra Gamble. I'm the lead news reporter at the Grand Rapids Press, part of MLive Media Group. I've been a journalist for 10 years now. I graduated with a journalism degree from Grand Valley State University in 2016. Yeah, I've been a journalist in West Michigan ever since.
Awesome. So I don't want to get too deep into it just to keep things fine, but do you have any experiences like that, maybe situations of trauma that you would be comfortable sharing, or that you kind of
Yeah.
what happened and that kind of stuff, if you don't mind sharing it?
Yeah, absolutely. So my first job right out of college, I was the crime and courts reporter, and I think a lot of us are right out of college. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's there's quite a bit of turnaround in that beat in newsrooms just because it's pretty fast paced and you see a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times those are the positions that people are looking to fill. And I don't necessarily know how much we really talked about that beat when I was in college. I mean, I have a journalism degree, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we ever really talked very much in class about the reality of what that really means. I mean, I definitely, it was a little bit of baptism by fire for sure.
Yeah.
So, my first job right out of college, I worked in a kind of touristy town on the shore of Lake Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
So, unfortunately, part of every summer pretty much is that people drown in
Mm-hmm.
Lake Michigan and associated bodies of water. And I remember the first time I ever saw a dead body while on my job. An older gentleman he was like getting the boat ready for the season. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what all of that
Mhm.
entails because I'm
Yeah,
not
I don't
of that tax
no
bracket.
clue. That's
But
fair.
whatever that means.
Mhm.
So it was, late spring, early summer. And while he was, I mean, it was still in the dock, and oh, you know what? Let me turn off my Teams notifications too, so that
Oh,
it's
you're fine.
not
Thank
um
you.
not going off crazy for you. Sorry.
Oh, you're fine. Thank you. I didn't even think of that.
Oh no, you're totally fine. Um, okay, sorry about that. So we had a scanner, a police scanner, always going in the newsroom, and possible drowning is always something you don't want to hear. So I, got in my car and I jumped down, and basically what had happened was this older gentleman, as he was prepping his boat for the season, hit his head on the boat and fell into the water I mean, the boat was still docked.
Mhm.
And I my like summer job in college was I was a camp counselor, and so I had been a lifeguard
Training.
previously. So I knew the statistics from like my Red Cross training of after 10 minutes you're pretty much out of luck. And so I mean I knew that, and of course first responders know that, but families don't always know that in emergency situations. So I show up, the dive team is there. They've got ambulances, the whole thing, all in this very quaint little touristy town.
Mhm.
And this gentleman's wife is, right there on the dock watching all of this happen. And it was probably, I'm going to say 45 minutes or so before, from the time he went
Went
into the
under.
water to when the dive team found him. And, I knew that's kind of the
It
point of
was
no
done.
return.
Yeah.
But of course, there, to a certain extent, first responders have to. I mean, I'm sure they knew too, but they still have to go through the motions a
Hope
little
and
bit. I
kind
think
of,
for
yeah.
the right, exactly. And so they started using an automatic AED or
Mhm.
an automatic chest compression machine, which is a really cool invention if you've never seen them before. But basically, they put it like around somebody's body, and then it does the chest compressions,
For them. Mhm.
for the people, because it takes out the human element of error and inconsistency and that kind of thing. But it is also incredibly violent to
Mhm.
watch. Like I mean, if you've never had to do CPR on someone, like if you're doing it correctly, you're cracking ribs, and this
Yeah.
machine basically does this, right? So, um, yeah, that was really scary. And I remember at some point, at part of my job of being on the scene, this was breaking news, was to, at the time, tweet, now X, I guess.
Yeah.
And so, I was saying I'm on the scene at, blah, blah, blah marina, and here's the circumstances. And at one point, one of the deputies comes over to me and he says, "Hey, I understand that you're media. Um, it's really bothering the spouse that you're taking photos. Could you, like, I'm not trying to make you to go away. Could you just, be respectful and not take photos?" And I said, "Of course." I was barely 21 years old, like barely.
Right.
And I was like, "Yeah, of course." Um, and I remember the managing editor at my newspaper at the time called me while, from the newsroom. He goes, "Why would you ever stop taking photographs? How dare you? You're on public property. You can take as many photos as you want." And I was just like, all right, hold up. Like, there's a dead body here. The wife is sobbing. I'm fresh out of
Yeah.
college.
You're like a baby.
I truly like a little Bambi legs journalist over here. And I, like, even in that moment, I was like, that's messed up. Like, I'm pretty shaken up. Like, there's a dead body in front of me. And here is this, like, grown man who's probably, I don't know, 15, 20 years older than me, like, screaming at me on the phone that I need to continue taking photographs of a dead body while the wife is, like, you know, watching her
Seeing her
husband dead
husband.
in front of her, right? So, and I remember specifically he wanted a photograph of like a hand like hanging off of the gurney kind of
Mhm.
thing, which for people not in the newspaper industry, there's this thing called the breakfast test or the kitchen table test.
Yeah.
People call it different things. But basically, it's like, you know, we report the news and sometimes the news is gruesome for sure. Like, that's
Mm.
life. But you also have to think about, like, in a print newspaper, people are reading this while they're drinking their coffee at the kitchen table. And there's like a just an ethical and moral line that like you're not going to publish that photo anyway. Like the kind of photo that he was
Yeah.
asking me to get, I was one, uncomfortable taking, and two, we never would have run in print anyway. And I just remember driving back from the scene, and it was probably, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes away from the newsroom. And I just sobbed in my car, like before I went back into the newsroom. And
Mhm.
I just was like, I can't do this. Like, this
No.
man is yelling at me to take photos of a dead body. This is, you know, first time I've ever seen a dead body like this kind of thing. And I just remember thinking, like, at no point in my life have I been prepared for this as a journalist. Like, this is new
No.
territory for me.
Well, and I think as someone like you said, if I'm reading the news or even looking online, I don't need the picture. I feel like you give me the
100%.
details. I have the visual. I know what happened. I'm very sad about
Right.
it. I don't need the gruesome picture.
Right. And I
Um,
definitely had, I mean, I had photos of the dive team. I had photos of all the ambulance,
yes.
you know, like it's not like I didn't have
You get the
anything, right? Like it
gist.
was exactly. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
guess that kind of leads me in something else I want to talk about, which I guess is like newsroom culture as a whole. So just
Yeah.
what I guess like what do discussions of that when you're in school for journalism look like? Like are you kind of warned by professors or by your educators like, "Hey, expect this," or "You know what? You know, you're going into this, you need to do this." Like what is that attitude and what does that look like?
Yeah. Um, I remember, and this is not at all a knock like on my degree, but I feel like I learned a lot more practicality wise from working at the student newspaper than I did sometimes in
Hmm.
the run of the mill classes. And I think a lot of journalism students would say the same thing. It's, you know, it's
Probably.
kind of a you learn by doing situation. And I remember I was probably maybe like at most a junior, probably a sophomore, and a student was killed in a car crash going to student teach. I mean, he was like still an active student.
Hmm.
And I remember I had to call the mom of the student
Oh
maybe
my
just a couple of
god.
days after the student had died. And
Hmm.
I was, I mean, definitely not 20, like, definitely even
Oh my
more of a
god.
little Bambi baby. And I remember asking my advisor at the time, who was this older gentleman, and he, you know, he had been in the news industry for a long time and was very much so of the like, we used X-Acto knives to cut out typos in the newsroom kind of, you
Yeah.
know, ilk. Um, and I remember asking him, frankly, how do I do this? Like, how do I make this phone call? And I was not that he probably even thought about it, definitely underage, but he goes, well, take a shot and then make the call. Like he told me to like take a shot of
Yeah.
whiskey or something and then make the phone call. And I mean, the message was very clear of like, you just do it. You know what I mean? Which isn't
Hmm.
necessarily wrong. Like you do make the uncomfortable phone call. That's what you do. But a little bit more helpful information could have been like, lead with empathy and ask for
Yeah.
them to share really
A
great
nice
memories of their child,
a
or
nice outline or something rather than the yeah.
like, here's how you break the ice, here's
Yeah.
maybe how you know, show
Uh,
compassion in this situation, like something more, um you know, like an outline of perhaps how to begin that conversation. That kind of thing would have been far more helpful than take a shot of alcohol and then make the
oh.
call.
Oh my
But I
god.
mean, that is I think that that is something that is severely lacking, and I hope is something that is becoming better. I hope that
Mhm.
there are more conversations that are happening about being able to decompress after working on really challenging stories, or like for sure the first newspaper that I worked at really never talked about like employee assistance programs or
Mhm.
counseling that's available or any sort of thing. Whereas the company that I work at now, that sort of thing is frequently talked about. So
Oh, that's
it
amazing.
definitely, it's well, no, it's truly night and day, and it's wonderful. But it does feel a little bit like I found a unicorn newsroom, and that
Mhm.
that is not the norm. And so, you know, when those aren't talked about super openly, and you're not, you know, being checked in on by an editor, or you're not, you know, just like, hey man, do you want to talk about what you just heard in
Mhm.
court? Or I know the medical examiner gave their
Yeah.
presentation today. That must have been rough, you know, that kind of thing. It's really hard. It's really hard.
Yeah. I never even thought about court until last summer I interviewed a professor who when she was that like 21, 22, 23,
Mhm.
had to deal with a murder trial, and it was
Yeah.
a man who it was I believe it was a man who killed his pregnant wife or girlfriend. So it
Jeez.
was
Yeah.
the baby as well. It was like a 9 month,
Yeah.
pregnancy. And
Oh
she just said
gosh.
like she said her friend like left the courtroom to go throw up when they pulled the
Yep.
pictures up. I mean, and she was like, and we were
Yep.
just told like she's like, so she said her friend just was like, you know what, I can't do this one. Like, if you want to dock me, if you want to yell at me, go for it. Her and I mean, she said she powered through, but kind of wishes she hadn't. I mean, it was
Well,
so
that's yeah, because when they seat a jury, I mean, a lot of people don't really know how this works, but when they seat a jury, they'll be pretty upfront with the jury and say, "You'll see graphic images during this trial.
right.
You need to tell us if you're okay with that. Like, you need to be aware, and if you can't handle that for whatever that reason may be, like, let us know and we'll pick somebody else."
Mm-hmm.
Nobody ever asks a journalist that.
Mm-mm.
Like, nobody ever says, you know, you're going to see the same stuff that the jury sees. You're going to see all the evidence. You're going to see all this
Yes.
stuff. And you just got to sit there. And not only do you have to sit there, but you have to look very neutral and be this like third party observer with no emotion on your face while you're
Yeah.
seeing these horrifying images. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's she said that too. She was like, I mean, it was I don't remember like what he pleaded or anything, but she's like, it was clear he did it. We knew it was like in that
Mhm.
she's like, we had to just look at these pictures of this woman and the baby, and she said it was just
Yep.
like she said that's the one that kind of like replays in her mind the most.
A
Um,
hundred percent. A hundred
but just
percent.
kind
I
of
think that's true too for
yeah.
me. Like for the most part over the years, you know, I've covered, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 murder trials. And
Hmm.
for the most part, I'm fine. I'm there, I'm doing my job, I'm taking really detailed notes, I'm doing the thing. But when there are children involved, when they either have to take the witness stand or when they're victims, I remember I covered a murder trial that was a gang related shooting, and a 14-year-old was the homicide victim. That one's always going to stay with me. I mean, that kind of stuff is really hard to forget, especially like specific phrases that the medical examiner used and that kind of thing. I mean,
Hmm.
I remember they talked, gosh, that trial was super long. It was maybe
Yeah.
2 weeks. I'll never forget that the medical examiner talked about this child's pulpified liver, that he, had
Yeah.
been hit so many times by
Hmm.
a high powered assault rifle that his liver had pulpified. Like, I'm never going to forget that phrase my
No.
entire life. Yeah.
No, and I'm a teacher, like I said, so when it comes to kids, like I'm a middle school teacher, so hearing 14, and if it's kid related, like
Mhm.
I'm the same way.
100%. I
That's
know.
where it hits.
Yeah.
I guess pivoting a little bit, what exactly was your journalism curriculum? Like, was it essentially just a lot of like writing classes and kind of more of the like foundational, like here's what a feature story looks like, here's what a news story looks like?
Yeah. I remember taking, yeah, I remember taking feature journalism. I remember taking, there's like an investigative class, but it was more about like where to find and analyze data sets, which for sure was definitely helpful.
Mhm.
But looking at crime statistics on like the Michigan State Police website is super different than
Yeah.
going to fatal crashes in real life, right? I mean, that's just is a
Right.
totally different ballgame. There were
Absolutely.
a lot of classes that were like journalism history, and I remember taking a course about how journalism has changed through like different advances in the internet and like Web 2.0, all of which is super interesting and fascinating, and I really enjoyed. But it wasn't necessarily helpful to
Useful.
know when like movable type presses became a thing when I was
Yes.
out on the scene
19
of
years
a,
old and
right.
right. Like, okay,
Exactly. Yeah.
cool. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna
I'm
like
like, great. This is, yeah.
how many classes were you just kind of like, why do I need this? Like, I feel like in high school I
So
thought that a lot, but
many.
even in college, yeah.
Yeah, well, and I
What?
mean, I think too, I was really grateful, and for sure, this is not the case for everybody, but I had a journalism class in high school. Like my high school had
Hmm.
a newspaper, and I am so incredibly grateful. That class was actually taught by a former Detroit news reporter, and she
Oh, that's
was the
amazing.
best thing ever. And so I remember getting to college and like my journalism 101 class, and even probably like whatever the second one was, I already knew all that stuff. I
Hmm.
just remember being so frustrated because it's
Oh,
like, I've done this. I already know this, like I was the copy editor of my high school paper. And I do remember there were a ton of advertising and public relations students like in the School of Communication that were in those
yeah.
classes too for, their electives or whatever. And it felt so frustrating that it felt like the professors, who I'm sure were very knowledgeable, had to kind of teach down almost to the
Yes.
non-journalism students in that course, which was frustrating as an
Someone
actual
who knew
journalism student.
everything and someone
Right,
going
I
for
know.
that degree.
I mean, I'm not trying to sound like a know-it-all. It just was like, oh my gosh, I've been here, done
No,
this, that kind of thing.
I felt like that with like writing classes even in college, like some of the
Yeah.
gen ed writing. It was like, oh my god, you guys didn't do this when you were like juniors in high
Right.
school.
Yeah.
Like it was just so infuriating. What were some
Yeah.
of like the most useful classes you found then, though?
Um, so I remember taking, gosh, I don't even remember the name of it, but um, it was a course it was a lot of kind of, here are different data sets that are available. Here's how
Mhm.
to kind of analyze and find them. I think it was the investigative reporting class. And it was actually taught by um, someone who works at the paper that I now work at, which is really
Oh,
cool.
yeah,
Um,
that's awesome.
and so that was really neat. And she gave a lot of really cool like tips and tricks of, let's talk about the realities of like when somebody tries to deny your Freedom of Information Act request, or let's talk about,
Hmm.
when the cops won't get back to you, that kind of thing. But it was all very theoretical still because we weren't
Yeah.
writing that kind of stuff at the student level. Like we weren't
Hmm.
going out to scenes. We weren't, we wrote, I guess that's not true. Sometimes, when crime would happen on campus, I guess we would write about
You
it,
were
but
there.
definitely not to the point of like looking at a police report. Definitely not like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I like that kind of like scenario type stuff though. Like for me, that's like something I've always like, even if it's not something I'm doing at that moment, at least for me, like that is something that sticks with me though, I feel like,
Oh,
compared to
totally.
other
Yeah.
stuff. So I get that. Um, what would you have changed? What are some changes you'd make to journalism curriculum, or at least, I mean, obviously your own, but wasn't that long ago. So I mean, what would you have
No.
changed?
um Make me feel slightly less old. No, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that it just would have been so helpful, and I sorry.
Oh, you're
I
fine.
fully understand like the reality of academia, and that like you have to have a master's degree and you have to, you're not
Hmm.
necessarily in the field anymore if you're a professor. But
Right.
it was so frustrating to me that most of my professors were folks that hadn't been actively in a newsroom in like well over a decade, if not more.
Hmm.
And I just felt like I wasn't getting the reality of
Yes.
what it was like anymore, of like what it was like actually being in the thick of it. Because I had these older professors who I'm sure were like kick ass journalists in their day,
Hmm.
but then they were telling us like well, I don't know what this newfangled InDesign thing is. Like it was so frustrating. And so it was a little challenging to feel like I was getting like real time information, I
Mm,
guess. I'm sure the information they were giving me were super valid, just not current. So
yes.
I've been asked a couple of times since I graduated to come back and speak to classes, and I will always, always, always say yes to that if I can, because I think it's so important
Yeah.
to have somebody actively in the field saying like, "Hey, man, nobody's going to tell you this, but if you're a crime reporter, you always have to show up to work with at least half a tank of gas in your car because you don't know where you're going to be headed."
Oh.
Like nobody told me that
No.
as a college, like, hey, you need to make sure that you have pencils and pens in your backpack because if you're covering a breaking news scene in the winter at Michigan, the ink in your pen is going to freeze. Like,
Oh. Like these little,
these are the things
yes.
that, like, no one ever told me until I was in the situation and my pen froze and I was totally SOL. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
these are the kind of things that, like, hey, you should probably have a change of shoes and maybe pants in your car in case you have to walk through mud, soot, craziness
Anything.
at a house fire, and you don't want to smell like ashes the rest of the day in the newsroom. Like, no one ever said
Just the
any of that
little,
to me.
those little tips and tricks and little like life
100%.
hack kind of things. Oh, that's so
Right,
funny.
right.
But I think like I also feel like in journalism, and again, I don't have a journalism degree. My master's even is journalism ed, but it does kind of feel like just from research I've done and even people I have talked to, there is such an attitude difference between like old school journalists and like new school like just that generational gap and that kind of thing. I
Yeah.
mean, just those attitude differences. I mean, it's crazy some of the people that you'll
Mhm.
talk to, and even like just gender differences. I hate like saying that, but it is so different, like hearing how
No, it
like
is.
just some older men talk versus even older women. It's like these different
Mhm.
experiences they've had. It's crazy just hearing those differences. So I can imagine like
Yeah,
in school
absolutely.
you're getting all of the, if it's older people, you're getting that old school attitude
Mhm.
as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, it definitely, in the newsroom that I'm in now, it is true. Yeah, I mean, I'm not kidding when I say it's like a unicorn newsroom. It's we're
Mm-hmm.
all so collegial with each other, which is not always the case. But there is an older gentleman who is definitely of the like old school
Yep.
newsroom ilk, and but he like if you ask him for help, if you genuinely ask him, you're like, hey, I'm really having a hard time navigating Pacer. I can't find this federal court document, or whatever it may be.
Mm.
I'm really having a hard time finding contact information for so and so. He will drop anything he is doing
Oh.
and help you
That's so
because
nice.
he has the skills.
Yeah.
And it is so endearing to me that all of the younger folks in our newsroom are truly and utterly obsessed with him. Like
Yeah.
he is their favorite person. They want him to go out to drinks with them on their birthdays. Like he is so humble
Mm-hmm.
and he is so kind when you are genuinely I mean he's gonna like neg you a little bit if you actually do know how to do
Sure.
it and you're just like bugging him. But it is so funny to me that he is absolutely flabbergasted by all of these like little young chicks
That's
in the
funny.
newsroom, like all these little chickadees that don't know what they're doing yet. Like they just flock to him and they just all want to soak in all of the knowledge that he contains.
Sure.
And he does not understand why these kids think he's cool. Like he,
He's
but
like, who
I
am
mean, it
I?
is right. He's like, what the hell do you guys like? Leave me alone. But it's so funny to me that like these young people, especially the ones that um, like graduated college during COVID and didn't
Yeah.
really get that sort of like in person first newsroom kind of
No.
place where you can flail a little bit. They just want to soak up every little bit of knowledge that this man has, and he does not understand whatsoever. But it's the cutest thing I've ever seen.
That is sweet.
And I mean, it's so clear that these younger journalists are desperate for this knowledge. Like they're desperate for these little tips and tricks, and they're desperate for, um, any sort of like advice that they can glean because it is a really difficult industry. no one's really looking out for you.
Yeah.
Nobody really likes the media, especially now.
Oh man.
And so it is so challenging to find like even a remotely soft place to land. And so
Yes.
when you find someone that has that little bit of knowledge that is happy to share it, it feels like such a little like comfort zone that you can be a little sponge and soak everything up. So
Yeah.
um unfortunately, I think those spongy people are few and far between. So it's
Yeah.
not always easy to find that. But when you do, man, hold on to that mentor
Cling to
as
them.
tight as you can. Yeah.
Yeah, I think teaching is similar in that too. I have like my some of my closest friends are like double my age and then some and it's like
Oh,
it's nice to
absolutely.
have
Yeah.
those people like that that very old school in
100%.
certain ways that I don't necessarily agree with, but like that I know if I need help or
Yes.
if I need something, they can tell me what it is.
They've been
I'm gonna
through it. They know. Yeah.
I'm gonna turn my light on real fast. I was using natural
Oh,
light and
no,
of
go right
course
ahead.
daylight savings, so one moment.
No, no worries.
All right, so sorry.
No,
um
it's totally all good.
So, going off of like curriculum, we've kind of talked about like trauma that journalists experience, but do you
Yeah.
find like in your curriculum there was preparation to deal with victims of trauma? Like you were talking about, the wife earlier and getting yelled at about that, but did you
Ooh.
find that like actually dealing with other people going through trauma, like what were ways to deal with that, or was that something you kind of learned on your own and with coworkers and friends?
I don't remember that. I mean, I may be misremembering, but I don't remember that ever being a topic. I do remember occasionally them saying, it's going to be tough sometimes. You're going to have to, you're going to see some stuff. And they never really went into detail of what that meant.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I never once heard any professor talking about different strategies to make a victim feel more comfortable speaking to the media or, ways to put them at ease in uncomfortable situations. None of that was learned until after I had graduated. And that definitely was something that I sought out on my own. Massive credit to the DART Center, which works a lot on kind of making guides for this kind of thing for journalists of trauma informed interviewing skills and trauma informed journalism. Um, and even just resources for journalists for their own trauma as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that has been like a really great resource for me over the years. But um, I definitely didn't know that they existed until
Yeah.
long after I graduated college. So those resources are out there, but you don't know what you don't know, right? So if you're in the thick of it and you're flailing a little bit and you don't know that there are things that you could be pointed to, it's not helpful unless you find it.
Yeah, I talked to someone on Monday about just kind of more strictly purely trauma, and she was talking about not only her own but that dealing with other, like when you're having to report on a case, and um she was talking about just like how when you are doing, especially like something that's an ongoing case or investigation, like you almost have to get that person on your side and to want to talk to you. So like she was talking about
Yes.
like how you need to approach things in a certain way, and no one like that, you kind of have to figure that out, and but also like you carry that on your back too, which was an interesting
Oh, for
conversation to have for
sure.
sure. And
Yeah.
just
Um, yeah, there's so when I was maybe a few years into my professional journalism career,
mhm,
that makes me so old to say, but I covered this case that I mean was truly horrific. It was a double fatal car crash, and it was a brand newlywed husband and wife that died in the crash. They'd only been married for 3 weeks when they died in the
mhm.
car crash. And the person that hit them was both drunk and high and had firearms illegally in his
Oh my
vehicle at the
god.
time. And they could see, so the couple had got married. They were very young, like I think kind of around my age, like early
Mhm.
20s at the time. And you could see the police lights from the crash from where they got married. So I mean, it just like top to bottom horrible, right?
Right.
And I remember I reached out to the families because, I really wanted to be able to tell people who these newlyweds were and not just how they died. And I remember reaching out probably through Facebook initially, I think. And I remember finally I got both sets of parents sat down in a room with me together
Oh.
to do an interview like about who their children were and all of
Mm.
this stuff. Um, but to get there it
Mm.
felt like a Mount Everest sized
I'm
task. And
sure.
it's so important, even just in like when you are doing an interview with someone who has gone through something so horrific as the death of their child, just things of like, we did an interview with them after hours when no one else was in the newsroom. It was just us. I made sure we had waters for them. I made sure we had lots of tissue boxes. I made
Mhm.
sure, they weren't really comfortable with like being filmed, and that was fine. Like anything that made them comfortable, it was my responsibility to provide that.
Yeah.
And I knew that that was going to suck. Like I just knew that that interview was going to destroy me. And I had actually, so whenever I'm talking to, and again, this is something that I learned on the job, but whenever I start talking to families who have lost someone in some sort of traumatic way, um, I always ask them to tell, like, the first thing I always say is just like, tell me about your brother, tell me about
Mhm.
your son, tell me about your mom. Because I think that there is the trauma of losing someone, and then there's the trauma of seeing it in the newspaper over and over and over. Anytime
Yes, you're
there's like a
reliving
court
it.
update, anytime there's a, you know, new motion to compel whatever for court, like it is a repetitive trauma and that makes it worse. And so to show someone that I genuinely truly care about who this person is that they lost, because I do, I mean, I'm a human being, I genuinely care about
Mhm.
being able to tell their story and not just how it ended, but also who they were. But being able to convince someone of that is so hard when they're in a
Mhm.
trauma cycle because they don't trust, and rightfully so. So
Mhm.
to get to that point is so much legwork. And even after you do get that interview and you go through the trauma of doing that interview, it's so important with trauma victims to over communicate. Like, if I'm doing like a new business is opening and I
Mhm.
interview the owner, I'm not necessarily, I do the interview, cool, good to go. I might send the link of the story when it's done to the business owner.
Yeah.
But if I'm doing a story about like a trauma informed interview, I am frequently communicating with that person after the interview of, just wanted to let you know this probably will publish in the next couple of weeks. Just want to let you know I've got all my photos. Just wanted to let you know this is definitely going to run on Sunday. And if anything changes, telling them that as soon as possible, because the whole time they're gearing themselves up
To
for
relive this
all of
and
this
redo
to
it.
relive it, right? So,
Mhm.
and everyone's going to be talking to them about it and they're all going to be sharing it on social media. Like that is another trauma that they have signed
Right.
up for and placed in your hands. Like that's so much trust. And it is very challenging, but it is also, and I believe this to my core, it is a massive honor to be given that trust.
Oh yeah.
And so I have to make sure that I'm honoring that trust that they're giving me and handling it like a little raw egg that I could break at any time, because I can.
Yeah.
Like any step that I make that takes away that trust from them, I can't get that back, especially from
Mhm.
someone that's in a trauma cycle.
Yeah. I think too I think especially like you said, now there is just so much mistrust in journalism, and so much of like you don't want to just look like you're using someone to get a story and get your name out there and then you're moving on. It's
Totally.
so important, like you said, to make it so human and to make it like you just honoring that person or honoring them and keeping them in the loop. That's amazing. Um, I guess knowing like the younger journalists that you work with, and knowing what you know, like, do you think things in journalism as a career as well as in the classroom will change or have changed. I know, like we said, there's nothing like actual real experience. I think most careers are
Yeah.
like that. But do you think like maybe they will start talking about trauma more, or there will be this how to take care of yourself when you deal with trauma? Like, do you see a change in that, or do you foresee a change?
I think I do. I mean, I'm not trying to be like unrealistically optimistic, but I mean, I think I have seen that
Mm-hmm.
change start to happen at least. And definitely I try to be a part of that change as often as I can. I mean, I know that there's some really great textbooks coming out now about mental health and
Oh,
journalism, and there are. I'm a part of a Facebook group called Journalists Covering Trauma. That is a network that you can kind of just trauma dump, and other journalists will support you. And we actually, as a group, send care packages to newsrooms covering mass shootings, and that's something
awesome.
that we send pizza, we send like fidget toys, we send like comfy socks,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So I think in order for it to change in the curriculum, it has to change in newsrooms too, because you kind of don't want to give students false hope that this is like
Mhm.
it's all rainbows and sunshine, and then it's like
Yeah.
you're standing on a bloody sidewalk, right? So I definitely think that the younger journalists are much more open to talking about this kind of thing, which I love. And I try really hard, like this sounds so cliche, but like I try so hard to be the editor that I wish I had had when I was
Yes.
starting out. So um when I know one of my reporters is like covering a really gnarly court case, as soon as they file that story, I'm like, hey, if you need to take the rest of the day, if you need to go walk around the block,
Mm-hmm.
if you need somebody else to cover the next thing, like just let me know and we will absolutely accommodate that. And I try really hard to, I mean, one, myself be aware of, but then also tell the reporters, like, hey, we have an employee assistance program. If you need it, we offer
Yeah.
8 sessions of therapy for you for free. If you need, like
Wow.
these are the resources available. Like, and I'm so glad that students in college now, um, are, I think, much more open to talking about their mental health struggles than they have been in the past. And
I
I
think so
need them
too.
to continue, yeah, like I need them to continue that when they get into the newsrooms, because that's where the change happens. It's not always easy, for sure. Like it's an uphill battle, absolutely. But if you don't ask for the help, I don't know that you need it.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely will check in. Like if I know, like if I had a rough time editing something that you turn into me, I'm absolutely checking in with you.
Yeah.
But if something was really triggering to you and I don't know that, I might not necessarily know that I need to check in about something. So, I'm so hopeful that those conversations are happening more and more, and I try to participate in them as much as I can. And when I do come in and speak to students in college, I mean, I don't try to like scare them, but I do say like, hey, you're gonna have to figure out what system works for you so that you don't, have like a bad coping mechanism. Like
Right.
you need to speak up for yourself in a newsroom. Here's little tips and tricks that work for me. Find what, you need to find a way to decompress and leave work at work sometimes. And that's so hard.
I
That's so hard as a journalist. But you have to figure it out or you're going to burn out so fast.
yes.
So I for sure, I don't think that it's like wonderful and they're telling students all of these resources and across the board that's just not the reality, but I'm so hopeful that those strides are starting and that there is actual research being done and there are these resources out there that might not necessarily have been there even 10-15 years ago.
Yeah, I think that from my research, the thing with journalism curriculum that is so, I think, frustrating is how across it's just there's no consistency between
Yeah.
university to university or classroom to classroom. Like I think it is
Mhm.
so inconsistent. So it was hard to like even research what it even looks like today in America. Like because it was like, here's what it
100%.
looks like. Some people did research on that and they're like, well, this is what it looks like at this school. A school, 15 miles away, it looks like this.
It's
And
totally, yeah, it's totally
it's
different.
crazy just how, and I think those like basic foundational things are there, but it's just even how they're conveyed or what's expected, and the
Right.
expectations
Are
are
they
so
more
different.
broadcast? Are they more print? Are they more
Yes.
whatever? Yeah. Well, and I remember when I was a student, I really wanted to study abroad. And I remember going to like our study abroad office, whatever that was
Mm-hmm.
called.
Yeah.
And I just remember saying, like, I really want like a journalism program. I really want, to do something overseas. And there was truly nothing. Like, there was truly
Mm-hmm.
nothing for journalism students. And I just remember being like, how is this possible? Like, there's nothing, there's no like sister university that has a journalism program, like, nothing. And I remember talking to my advisor about it because I was so frustrated. And she said, well, of course there isn't. All journalism in the world is based off of American journalism. And so they come
Mm-hmm.
here. We don't go
Other
overseas.
places. Mm-hmm.
And I remember being like, well, but what if I want to be a foreign correspondent one day? Like, how do I learn, whatever? And I did end up finding there's this like one group that did I think they were like summer trips
Yeah.
that were kind of journalism based, and some of them were more like, you could go to like the Cannes Film Festival, which sounds amazing, but like wasn't really what I was looking for.
What you want to do?
But one of them was you they had like some sort of partnership with the BBC, and you could report in Israel for a few weeks.
Oh
And I was like,
wow.
oh my gosh, amazing. I mean, certainly different time, definitely less
Yeah, I was
tumultuous.
gonna say.
Not, I'm sure currently that program is not, but I remember going to my study abroad office and I was like, can I, I found this trip or this program. Can I get credit for it? Like college credit for it, whatever. And I had to go to this like very scary meeting with the like study abroad director guy. I had to write an essay about why I felt I could handle myself in a country that was on the like State Department watch list
Oh.
of like maybe not a great place, to go kind of thing. And then they took a look at the program, and you spent, I think, like one day in the West Bank during the program.
Mm-hmm.
And they immediately told me there was no chance that I could go and get college credit.
Oh.
They were like, well, you could go and pay for this entirely yourself. No scholarship available, absolutely no college credit. Like, you could go just whatever. But if you get into trouble, like, the university will have no resources available to get you home, because we're advising that you don't go to this program. And I just was like, cool,
Oh.
thanks. So I ended up
Okay.
not going, but like, I mean, why would I go and spend thousands of dollars when I wasn't going to get any college credit for it? But
Yeah.
they basically were saying, like, anywhere where any sort of like, I understand as an institution, there need to be risk averse. Absolutely. But like, I wanted to do a journalism program that by its nature required some reporting on some sort of conflict somewhere else in the
Sure.
world. Like, that's what I wanted. And the university was immediately not willing to work
I
with
was like,
me
nope.
on. They were like, you can go, but it's entirely on you. You're accountable for your own safety. We will not help you. And I just remember
No.
being like, cool.
Never
Like,
mind.
awesome. I guess I'm not studying abroad.
Oh.
So yeah, I remember that being really disappointing. But I mean, I do understand why they were like, hard pass. We're not sending one of our students into the West Bank.
Right.
Like, I get it. But at the time, I just felt like so devastated because I really wanted to, you know,
Go.
do those things. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that is really all the questions I had and all the points I had. So
Awesome.
thank you so much again for
Yeah.
being here. Was there anything else you wanted to add or say or anything?
No, yeah, we covered a lot. So yeah, sorry, I feel like I
Awesome.
trauma dumped on you a little bit.
No,
So
I love it. I need this was
okay,
I
cool.
will say
Okay, cool.
like because you talked about the Facebook group earlier, which is how I found you, and
Yeah.
and be seeing that, and again, not a journalist, don't have journalism experience, but just even like that, seeing the interactions in that group
Mhm.
has just, and the support has been amazing. Even when I
Yeah.
requested help, I mean, I had like 30 something comments of people
Yeah.
willing to
We
jump in
want
and
to help.
help,
We
and
want to.
yes, it
Yeah.
is
I mean, and I think
amazing.
that but I think that is like still fairly new. I mean, not the Facebook group, but like it's pretty new for us to want
That
to.
kind of support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's so wonderful that it exists, but it
It's
definitely
so
hasn't
pure.
always been there. So it's yeah,
Yeah.
it's really great. And I
Yeah.
mean, it's even like, we've taken that, in our newsroom. We just had someone who left our newsroom and she got a new job in Maine. And unfortunately, she has been covering the Lewistown shooting.
Oh my God.
And so I was like, all right, well, I want to support Marie, so I'm going to put together a care package for her like they do in journalists covering trauma. So we sent her like her favorite bubble tea and some comfy socks and
That's
like
so
whatever.
sweet.
But um like that kind of, if I want that support to exist, then I have to help facilitate it
Yes.
existing in my industry. So, which is
And
hard. It's hard and it takes time, but it's so important.
it's so cheesy, but it is those little things that like keep you going and
100%.
keep you motivated. I mean,
100%.
really is like, but yeah, but thank you so much again for
Of
being here.
course.
I
And if you have
appreciate
any
you.
questions or whatever, always, feel free to Facebook me. So I'm here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then
Yeah, no problem.
all right, so I hope you enjoyed that. I thought we had such a great conversation, and um we were able to just kind of bring up really interesting points and stories and kind of hopeful solutions for the future. I think both of us seem pretty optimistic and hopeful about the future, despite, how slow things may seem. I actually recorded with Audra before I recorded with Aaron from episode 2. And I would have loved to. I really loved in episode 2, Erin kind of talking about how she thinks field work is so important in journalism. And again, I touch on that a lot in episode 2, but I would have loved to talk to Audra about that, just kind of seeing like her perspective or thoughts on that, and if she would think that is being necessary, because after talking to so many people and hearing these stories, I kind of am starting to agree, and I'm thinking that more jobs need to have these like fieldwork internship type things. But again, I hope you really enjoyed this episode. This was a really great episode to create and was so informative and so helpful for me to just understand that perspective again as someone who's not, you know there's only so much research can do, right? But hearing these anecdotes, it really helps me to relate to some of my experiences, or helps me to understand exactly what journalists go through. So I hope you enjoyed, and thank you so much for listening. Bye bye.